Okay, good afternoon. Yeah, good on you, Paul. That's not sure what. As you can see, I'm not the Reverend Paul. Thanks, John. Thank you. Okay. Maybe if I can just start off, you've just had another workshop an hour and a quarter ago, so that's probably still sort of resonating in your head. Can I just get one or two responses from what your experience of the first workshop is? Put them out there in the ether, and then I'll try and link up some of what we're going to be doing in this workshop with your previous experience. There's a lot to come in over the top of another workshop. Does anybody get...
before we start,
yes, Paul?
could our technical people turn the light off behind you, if that's possible?
Okay, let's see if they can do that.
I'm sure in sort of...
I've got a corona around me, have I?
It's a bit hard to see your face looking into that light.
Oh, right. There's always a way, isn't there? Thank you. How's that? Better? Yeah, okay. Okay. Thank you, Paul. Okay, anybody would just like to throw out something that they've got from their previous workshop? Yes.
Yeah, attended the spirituality workshop.
Yes.
I didn't realize how much spirituality is also involved in the synodality in terms of not only the God dimension, but also personally. He was talking about a wound that we have, and through the wound we can discern where God has given that to us to pursue that.
Right.
But in doing so, also being mindful of the fact you don't impose that on someone else. But be mindful of the fact that God has created that wound, but it's a special one for you in pursuing that. I mean, I don't quite understand that, but it did something that I can reflect on.
Okay. It struck you. It struck you. I think, well, synodality in a way is, it's probably a wound and as a response to a wound within the church. If we look at it even from a psychological point of view, but I think what Bishop Greg is talking about is very much within the Carmelite tradition, that the wounds are not to be run away from, but you stay with them, embrace them, and you see them as a portal into a greater intimacy with God. Yeah, thank you. We'll certainly be touching on some of that as well. Thank you. Thanks for doing that. Thank you. Anyone else? Yeah.
I was at the intellectual session with Archbishop Fisher.
Yes.
And he spoke about this proto-synodality in the tradition, practically from the church fathers.
Mm-hmm.
And he spoke about synodality in the contemporary magisterium.
Right.
So he kind of clearly demonstrated how the idea of synodality somehow evolved all throughout the centuries.
Yes, it's not something that just the Pope just plucked out of the air. And here we are with this very new concept. It's been there. Yeah, thank you. Anyone else? Okay, well, thanks for those two comments. As I say, I'm not Reverend Paul Moncret. What I want to be doing in this workshop is, I guess, taking a grounded view of synodality. I'm a psychologist. I've been working with the church now for about 30 years. And I have a fortunate position. Feel like I've got a foot in both understanding a little bit about the sociology, the psychology and the spirituality of how the church hangs together. But I also work as a psychologist with both clergy and lay people. I also teach pastoral theology at the Catholic Institute. Just casting our minds back to what Archbishop Tim was talking about this morning, and he used the image of Jesus catching up with people, walking beside them, and that maybe then they recognise him. He used the words to encounter, to listen, and to discern. To use those three words. I might also mention there's a copy of my paper on your table. So you can get a copy and you can follow it through if you want to. I'll be diverging a little bit from it, but you don't have to worry about notes. The time of evangelisation by exhortation alone is probably over. By that I mean we tell people, the clergy, the faithful, what the truth of the gospel is, and somehow we expect that they will imbibe it. I've also got a subheading there under the big heading of Can Synodality help me grow as a person, disciple and leader of a faith community committed to mission? I've said, synodality is a doing word. It's not a concept that kind of sits there without any purchase. Inside the notion of synodality is a verb. We get together to talk so that we can do, and we can do more effectively. Now, I'm going to talk together, I suppose I'm going to be talking eventually together with you, but at you for about 15 minutes, just to try and situate what this division up of the template in the conference is: a human, spiritual, intellectual and pastoral. Where does that come from? What's it got to do with synodality? And is there something to do with the way we've divided everything up and synodality? So I'm going to be looking at, as obviously, the human dimension of synodality. It's humans who will enter into the Pope's invitation to think together under the guidance of the Holy Spirit. So from this perspective, humans are indispensable. Now, the purpose of this whole conference is: how will your participation in the process of synodality allow you, as ordained ministers of the gospel, to assist the faithful to come into an experience of Christ? So let's look at the word synodality. It's become a bit of a buzzword for a broader participation of all Catholics in the Church's life and governance. You're probably going to get a bit sick of hearing the term synodality over and over again. I'll raise it though. What's the difference between a synodality? A synod is a legacy of Vatican II, where issues of importance to the Church are addressed. And the current synod is the 16th. The Pope wants attention on the manner in which important matters are discussed. I had somebody that I was speaking to in the preparation of this workshop. When I asked them what they thought about synodality, he said it's a little bit like standing on the Titanic while the staff are off having a meeting about how to talk together. But it struck me as it's not a bad thing that the staff are talking together, because it might help them avoid the iceberg. There's a kind of a false dichotomy that I think is around the place at the moment. Synodality is just, a talk fest. I don't think that's at all what the Pope is suggesting. I believe that Pope Francis's instinct is right. That is, we have to get together to work out how we're going to talk about important matters. There are a plethora of competing voices among church members at the moment. Anybody who's in ministry will be aware of that. The conservative voice is over against the liberal. The traditionalist is voicing different concerns to that of the so-called progressives. So as far as the Pope is concerned, before we go on, we have to learn how to talk together. You can't work anything out together if you can't talk about it. There are many vested interests in the outcome of this upcoming synod, and many are in conflict and separated from each other. So the Pope wants us to begin talking across the many divides and to talk openly, with compassion and candour, and in a respectful, attentive manner, to get the conflicts out in the open, so to speak. For the Pope, synodality is about journeying together under the action of the Spirit within the communion of the body of Christ and the missionary journey of the people of God. It involves dialogue, discernment and shared decision-making. And it seems to me that in initiating the synod process and citing the Holy Spirit as its protagonist, the Pope has kicked the Church into crisis and is trusting that the Holy Spirit will sort it out. Now, the actualising of what's been initiated here is vast in scope, and it's complex in execution. The goal of this 16th Synod is to shed light not on a particular goal, like priestly formation, but on the process of achieving an understanding of and a participation in the process of dialogue whereby a goal might be reached. Now, there's been much comment on the many practical issues that such a goal might raise, and I want to have a look at those as we move through this afternoon. However, ideas can change culture, and allowing the faithful and the clergy, faithful include the clergy, and the faithful to imagine the prospect of voicing their opinion is now a bell that can't be unrung. Now, conversation and dialogue within the church has always existed, of course in one form or another. It hasn't had to wait for a synod on synodality for conversation to begin. There's been lots of, I suppose, conversational dialogue in a very formal sense, where conversation tends to happen along party lines. Then there's the other sort of conversation, which seems to be pretty legion at the moment, where people are getting together, voicing their concerns, but it's difficult to actually get those concerns scooped up and heard in the way that they need to be heard. The plenary council tried to do this, and I think the Pope is wanting to take it one step further. I don't think the Church has always been ready, though, to have such a focused, self-conscious conversation where differences are expressed openly, articulated respectfully, and I wonder if ever there would have been, unless it was mandated to do so, and the process has started, for good or ill. Now, I just want to have a look at the current template of this conference. So human, pastoral, intellectual, spiritual. The current conference input is structured on the template of 4 pillars of priestly formation. Some of you will be familiar with this. It was set out in the document Pastores Daba Vobis. And so there are 4 subsets. People would be familiar with this, I think, wouldn't you? Pastores Daba Vobis, the 4 pillars of priestly formation. Now, when I first saw this, I thought, it's a bit of a blast from the past. Pastores Daba Vobis was the fruit of the 8th Ordinary General Assembly of the Bishop Synod, convened back in 1990. And Archbishop Schotter, General of the Synod of Bishops, referred to the Synod of Bishops as one of the first and most direct fruits of the Second Vatican Council. He said that every synod is an event of great importance which contributes continuously to the process of implementing and deepening the Council's intention to ensure the Church's continuous updating. Now, synods are places where people get together to talk. I think the current Pope has indicated by suggesting that there be a synod on synodality that perhaps the way discussion happens in those synods needs a little bit of tweaking. Pastores Daba Vobis was the first magisterial document to use the term human formation, a concept that had hitherto been either assumed or overlooked. In spite of what appears to be its common sense meaning, it bears closer inspection. Pastores Daba Vobis endeavours to spell out what a psychologically healthy priest should be, and it focused on the human person first and foremost, and what a priestly formation should assist in producing. Now, just to comment on the word human, as in human formation or as in human workshop. For me, it seems a bit clumsy and ambiguous. We're all human, but a human who understands him or herself to be made in the image and likeness of God is going to be a different prospect to one whose self-understanding is defined in a more secular sense by the achievement of his or her human potential. So what's being referenced here is the experiential dimension of the human person best viewed through the lens of psychology, but in the service of the human person made in the image and likeness of God. Sometimes we use the term human, it's only human, indicating we're all a little bit flawed and we're never really going to get there even if we try. I don't think that's how the term human is being used here. It's human understood as being made in the image and likeness of God. Now, in Pastores Daba Vobis, back in 1992 it was promulgated, only the most positive aspects of the individual were listed there. And it lists what sort of human person the priest should be and is somewhat idealised. It stresses the importance of the priest's capacity to relate to others and his affective maturity. it's right as far as it goes, of course, but it's expressed, seems to me, expressed in a mix of positive psychology and the theological virtues. And the 4-pillar template is now 32 years old, still a template that's used not only in priestly formation, but as a lens through which clergy are encouraged to self-reflect. A good example is this conference. The template still seems to have something going for it. I was employed back in 1991, a long, long time ago, at St Patrick's College, Manly, at about the same time that Pastores Daba Vobis was promulgated, and I was hired to look at the newly minted Human Formation program at the seminary. This saw the introduction of psychology into the program of priestly formation, and implicit in this introduction was the fact that students could talk about their experiences to develop self-understanding, and talk they did. And the culture of the seminary changed from one-way dialogue from staff to students and staff talking together. Now, what I'm trying to do here is to link the concept synodality to that category of human formation, which the 8th Synod gave birth to. As just you were mentioning before, synodality has had a very long history. I think it's the next step on from recognising the priest as human person whose humanity needs to be thought about, reflected on, theologised and psychologised about. What synodality does is move us into the next dimension, I suppose, of human experiencing, which is how to dialogue, how to listen to the other, how to listen, how to work together to bring about the truth of Christ. We're still focusing on human capacity in synodality, but this time the human capacity is to dialogue, to talk together, to listen and to respect each other's differences, and that's very difficult. So I think psychology can give us a little bit of an idea about the process that's actually required. Look, what I might do, so that it just doesn't become another talk fest, can I just get you, for about 5 minutes, if you could talk with your other people at the table, how do I imagine synodality is going to change the church culture, if at all? Can I just get you to sort of buzz about that for 5 minutes? So how is synodality going to change, alter, modify the church culture? What springs to mind? What comes into my imagination? Maybe we just come back into the big group again. Sorry to cut the conversation off, but has anyone got anything they would like to share with the larger group? Any thoughts that you might have had? Yes.
The mic coming.
Here comes the mic.
Maybe I find it easier if I go first.
You go first.
I think I was just sharing about the Vatican II and how that changed the shift in the worship from the passiveness of the laity to the laity getting involved. But unfortunately, we're still at that place where the Catholic faith is more like very convenient. You can go to any parish, you get your sacrament, and off you go. So that's currently the mindset. But to get the people then to a place where to have a voice and be involved, I think that's a big challenge. And we talk about clericalism, but I think it's both ways. I think that people are also content for Father because he knows it all, and then I don't have to do anything. So I think the change of mind shift, I think.
Yes, there's sort of laicalism as well as clericalism, isn't there? And a kind of a stuck way that things just happen. People just can go anywhere. It's a bit like the McDonald's motif, you can go anywhere, get your mass, fix, and you're not necessarily be part of the community. I think that's true. There are some parishes where there is involvement with each other, but it's not the norm, and that's a sad thing. Yeah. Would anyone else like to comment on that? It's all very well to try and encourage people to dialogue. That's the point that you're making, but the laity sometimes don't really seem as though they want a dialogue.
Don't have the time.
and they don't have the time. Yeah. And I think there's a history to that, though. I think that it's just kind of making do. We're just going along and getting our own spiritual needs met, and that's really important. Now, kind of why is that? Is there a Eucharistic famine? Is that what we're actually talking about in the truest sense of the word? We've thingified the Eucharist. We've kind of objectified it. Sorry, somebody... Yes, John.
I think there's also a movement from listening and discernment into saying, let's just shut up and do something. So having gone through 2 diocesan synods, seen plenary council, there seems to be a rush to governance to look as though we've done something, that we've achieved something, to make sure that we haven't wasted our time. Whereas I think the synod is actually saying this active listening and discerning of God's Spirit in our own contemporary culture, and saying, how does that make a difference to the way we come together as church?
Yeah. I think there are skills that enable dialogue to take place which have not been a priority to learn within the kind of the sociology of it all. Spirituality of it, maybe, but certainly the way the church functions, the hierarchical, how it functions, what happens when, it tends to militate against a dialogical environment in which you expect that there is going to be the exchange of opinion. Now, there's opinion and opinion, but just say that last point again, John. Just that they're very. Can you remember it? What you just said, the last bit.
What about the listening? Then
Yeah. Say that.
An ongoing process. So it's not just a rush into governance.
Oh, okay. Yes. Okay. Yes. Yeah. That's. I knew that the thought made me think something, and then I forgot what you said. Yeah, I think that's right. Rather than let it mature, and there be a sort of a corporate kind of discernment, there's a rush to get something hammered out and hammered down and put it in some sort of format that might be overlooking a whole lot of stuff that still needs to be heard. Is that right? Yeah, okay. I think that's true. I think it's underneath the frustration of a lot of clergy. Yes, Paul?
Janiene, just building on what John has just
Yes.
said, I think there was a good practical example in the workshop on pastoral.
Yes.
With the experience of Chatswood Parish.
Yep.
Where one of the interesting things about it is how hard they have to work to form the facilitators of the table groups.
Yes.
Because people resist active listening. We're not used to sitting around in a group, actually just being still, being quiet, listening to other people without cutting in and talking over them.
Yes.
And that's not just the church, that's the whole of society.
It is.
And that's part of the change in culture. It's not just changing the culture within the church, it's how we are part of a wider culture.
Yes, I think that's true. There's certainly more formation that needs to happen, certainly amongst the laity. But the norms as to how the church functions, the environment within it need modification. I want to go on and have a look at some practical examples drawn from the behavioural sciences as to perhaps the skills that are needed now to be inserted in this and accompany this process of synodality. So anyone else? Thanks for that, Paul. Otherwise I'll just...
Janiene,
Yes, Tuan.
Janiene, you mentioned about you teaching at mainly in 1991 and one of your students at that time. And I remember exactly that when you mentioned about start one-way dialogues, start to students and student and staff talk together.
Yes.
And I experienced that. The question I like to ask, and interesting to know that what happened to our brother priest before you arrived, because when at Manly there's only one-way dialogue.
Yes.
Staff to students, and now I would like to know that maybe our senior priest can help me that how they adjust to that. how they adjust to that situation that before is a one-way dialogue, staff to students.
Yes.
And they experience that, and then now they are doing their pastoral work and how they adjust to that.
Right, which one's adjusting? The ones post 1991 or prior to 1991?
Prior 1991.
Look, I think there are some here that would have done their formation in before 1991. And I think look, I've always found there's a great willingness on the part of the clergy to try, and I mean, I know there's exceptions, but it feels like if this is a good idea, let's do it. Now, we might do it with various levels of expertise, but oh well, here's the bringing psychology into the program. Oh, okay, wonder what that's going to mean. So there was a kind of a cautious movement towards it when it didn't look too scandalous or it didn't really make much difference. There was a cautious appropriation of it. But I still think it's difficult when you've... it's not just the way you're formed, it's the norms that are implicit in the kind of formation you get in a seminary and then immediately post-seminary that kind of sets you up with a particular lens whereby you interpret the church environment. You're going to see it in a certain kind of way, and the way you see it is going to be informed by the precedents that have impacted upon you personally. So initially, after 1991, there was resistance, certainly across the board. It was ridiculous to have a woman on staff, all that kind of stuff. And then eventually it just became the norm because ideas change culture. And if the idea sticks around for long enough and it doesn't look like it's destructive, the culture then starts to reorganise around it. And I think the same thing's going to happen with synodality. It looks like, well, you can criticise it from a number of ways. It's an ill-defined concept. It's Pope Francis's flight of fancy. It's impractical. How are we going to hammer it down? But as I say somewhere, I think, where you tell the faithful that there may be a possibility of dialogue, that is a bell you can't unring. So the idea is out there. What's it going to mean? I don't know that I experienced any clergy formed before 1991 who found too much difficulty with, I mean, there might have been difficulty with students, I mean, there always is, but where there was an inability to accept a more humanly based, along the lines of Pastoris Dabo Vobis. That seemed, I think, was received cautiously, and it seemed like a good idea, even if individuals found the whole prospect a little bit challenging. In other words, people have to put themselves out there as a pastoral supervisor. Oh, how do I do that? I'm not used to doing it. And that's understandable. I think mandating change, telling a group of people that there has to be change, is a fraught exercise. It's a high-risk strategy and it's probably not going to work. People are going to say yes, yes on the surface and no, no underneath. So you're going to get resistance. But is that okay, Tuan, what I just said there? Yeah. There are... there have been all through the church. Think about the movement from Greek to Latin back in the 4th century. It was a great big barney then. The movement from Latin to the vernacular back in the 60s. Terrible. Now there's a movement back. You know, the divisions within the church are really quite legion. Now, I don't think people are going to be able to talk across the divide, even if they have a good will to talk across the divide, unless the skills that haven't been sort of front and centre within clergy formation, unless those skills somehow get a little bit more prominence. They still don't have a lot of prominence, unfortunately, and I've been teaching pastoral studies now for 30 years. There's still a sense that they're not the real academic subjects. The real stuff is scripture and theology. Philosophy, of course, that goes without saying. And then if we got a bit of time, we can put the pastoral in somewhere. And it's interesting, in the last, I don't know, gosh, talking decades now, say 6 years, I've had 4 priests who I taught years and years ago who have got back to me, who've told me that they're actually involved in counselling studies, because they realised after all this time that it was a really good thing. It was going to be essential for them to be able to be present, to discern, to listen, because it's very difficult to listen to something you don't understand. It's really hard. So can psychology give us the tools to be able to bear witness to where people are at, to make, to be hospitable to ideas that we don't really agree with? And how do people develop the skills of dialogue, but also one of the church's tasks, I think, is to be present to a suffering world. The world becomes more and more a place of suffering overtly the longer we go on. How to bear witness and understand that suffering world, and how to bring the gospel perspective to bear upon it. The skills of being able to dialogue are important. Well, look, what I want to have a look at now is the process of synodality, the process, like what actually is going to be required from a psychological point of view if it's actually going to take off. What some of the issues are that are going to be raised that I think have to be taken seriously, not, oh, well, that was a pity, synodality didn't work. Well, it didn't work because the skills weren't there. And then ask you to just address a couple more questions. Because how much time have we got? When do we finish? We finish at 3:15. Have we got 3:15? So we've got about 50 minutes. All right, if you can just bear with me while I talk at you again. So I've already made the point, trying to link synodality with what preceded it in terms of human formation back in 1990. Synodality invites reflection, this is page 4, invites reflection on the process of getting together to discuss issues of great importance, that is the nitty-gritty of dialoguing, hearing alternate points of view, countenancing them, and putting up with the resultant tensions. More particularly, it seeks to focus on how the Spirit is moving through and with the body of Christ in the human reality of dialogue, both inside and outside the church, so that the mission of evangelisation can be fulfilled. I think synodality gets sort of less precise in providing direction the more you think about it, but I think it's still true that ideas shape cultures, and this is a bell that can't be unrung. So how's the idea of synodality likely to shape church culture? You've had a chance to now think about that, at least to begin to think about it. Now, I'd just like to have a look at some practical challenges from a psychological point of view, and then start to say our starting point once again is the human reality. Synodality focuses not on the ideal priest, but on the messy starting point of one human being endeavouring to journey together with another human being, be they bishop, priest or lay, and where both are endeavouring to live and spread the gospel and talk to each other. And the focus is not on seminaries here, not on the presbyterate, that's the easy bit, but on all the people of God. And to term this as a big call is an understatement. So we've shifted now from what makes up a functioning integrated human, who may be called a priesthood, into the realm of relationship, which both precedes and is the result of dialogue, and to how those relationships should proceed in the ecclesial structure. And this is the hard bit. Now, if we go down to have a look at one of the features of a dialogical process that's been mentioned, was certainly mentioned this morning by Archbishop Tim, is to encounter the other and then to listen. Now, the typical dimensions that characterise a synodal style are listening, openness to others' opinions, discernment and maintaining communion while bearing tensions around disagreement. Now, you could have a workshop, and I'm speaking as a psychologist here, you could have a workshop on each of those points that are mentioned there. You could have a whole half day. Now let's look at one of these dimensions, and that is that of listening. Now this might sound like a common sense injunction. Anyone can do it if they have the intention to do, surely. Unfortunately, this is not the case. Conversation's the primary means of reaching understanding between people. When we engage in dialogue with another, there's an exchange of words, but also an exchange of persons. This happens to varying degrees and intensities. If I truly listen to the other, I will be affected emotionally by their communication, and vice versa. My subjectivity will be affected by the other's subjectivity. True dialogue raises emotions on both sides, and those emotions can be raised before my intellect gets into gear. Now, the human sciences have studied at length what happens to the human person when engaged in dialogue about an issue that's important to both of them. It's almost impossible for a dialogue to be equal in emotional intensity on both sides. One person will assume the role of listener more than the other, and because of the emotional impact of listening, deep feelings can be elicited, and clarity of thought can go out the window. But the more you do it, the better you get at it. Eventually, one starts to notice the emergence within oneself of what psychologists call metacognition, which is the capacity to monitor oneself as one dialogues, to change pace, to refocus, to assess the level of arousal and recalibrate energy, and to monitor my motivation. It goes along with the examen of conscience. It's actually what you're doing with the examen of conscience. And I need to allow myself to become aware of my own motivation when I'm dialoguing. Am I seeking to be in communion with my dialogical partner, or do I seek to dominate, to get my own way? In my opinion, this kind of thinking, which involves honest self-reflection, is an invitation to the Holy Spirit to animate the dialogue. I'm sure that all of you here will have had the experience where you are listening to somebody that you're trying to minister to, and you become aware that the Spirit is with you. You're not the only one doing the listening. There's another presence present with you. Now, the Holy Spirit's portal to the soul of the human person is via human experience. God can go past the sensory data and get to you if God so wants to do it. But the usual means is via the sensory data, travelling to the brain's emotional centre, the limbic system. Listening is a very bodily experience. I'll feel what I hear before I have a thought about it, and the emotion generated, if unacknowledged, will affect my thinking. Now, I've given you a diagram there of the triune brain. Sensory data comes up the brain stem, the reptilian brain, as distributed to various parts of the brain to sort out whether it's kinesthetic, auditory, olfactory, visual. Once that data has been acknowledged in various parts of the brain around the temporal lobes, it gets filtered into the limbic system, where there's an emotional evaluation of that sensory data. And only then is the information passed to the rational or the thinking brain. So we will, in a dialogue, we're going to feel before we think. And it's a good idea sometimes to know, well, why am I feeling the way I'm feeling? What am I not hearing? What is the other person saying that I simply can't hear? Listening is also a spiritual discipline. When we listen to another person, it's important to do so. We make ourselves vulnerable to the other. And why vulnerable? Because I may be invaded by a truth that I'm not ready for. And we have an example of challenge in Mark's Gospel, where Jesus is challenged by the Syrophoenician woman. Most of the time, we're unconsciously scanning to hear something that is affirming of me and my values, or that is comforting and soothing, or that's simply true as far as I'm concerned. It's hard to let another's truth take up residence in me sufficiently so that I can understand it. A lot of what we have to hear is difficult to countenance. But in ministry, a lot of what you have to hear is difficult to countenance. Innocent suffering, where you can feel helpless. People complaining about the current state of the church when they're uninformed. Gossiping about others. Spiritual rigidity. Blaming others. The hysteria of sudden grief or being misunderstood. But if I'm to hear and interpret rightly, I must be able to interpret correctly what's being said, and that'll require me to cope with being affected by what I hear. I need to ask the question, why do I feel so distressed, so challenged, so uncomfortable, and not dismiss it, but wait for the answer to occur to me? This usually requires another one to help me. It can be the benefit of a psychologically oriented supervisor or a seasoned spiritual director. Now, just turning to the scriptures for a moment, the Lord wakes me to hear like a disciple. So we've just read in Holy Week, Isaiah 50, the Lord has given me the tongue of discipleship to sustain the weary with a word. He awakens me morning by morning. He awakens my ear to listen as a disciple. So to listen like a disciple, I need to build within myself an expectation that I may hear the Spirit's presence and demand for truth through the words of another who addresses me, even when I don't like what I hear. So to listen like a disciple, I need to build within myself an expectation that I may hear the Spirit's presence and demand for truth through the words of another who addresses me, even when I don't like what I hear. Now, I'm going to stop talking for a moment. I'm just going to ask you, can you address either one of those questions, I don't mind which one you look at, in bold type? The first one is, can I imagine that listening attentively and letting myself be affected by what I hear will assist my disciple leadership? And the second question is, do I think dialogue will allow discernment of the Spirit's guidance of the church? So what are my thoughts? Either one of those, I don't mind. And then talk amongst your friends at the table. I'll just give you 10 minutes. Okay, is everyone clear? Have you all got the questions in front of you? Great, okay. Okay, thanks for that. Now we just come back into the larger group. Thanks for that. Would anyone like to share with the broader group a thought that may have occurred to them? Which one?
Sorry, I talk a bit today.
No, you're not. That's good. I'm glad someone is.
In the first question, you say that whether listening affect my leadership, and I share with my brother priest in my table. I said, you mentioned about only a couple of priests that become counselor, and it struck me a lot because we in the seminary we learn a lot of philosophy and theology and other stuff, but I never remember that we were trained to be good listeners in the seminary, and we trained to do to be a good preachers and good homilists and all sort of things. But and I said, and I share with my brother priest in my table that just last Sunday, a mother with two boys, teenager, came and asking me for the sacrament of reconciliation, and I didn't give her a chance to explain to her situation. I just stopped her completely. I said, "Why it's too late? Why you let me stand here?" Now listening to you, and I said, it affects me.
Yes,
If
good
I
example.
listen to her, I can be a better priest.
Yes, okay, that's an excellent example. Everybody hear that? That's a very honest self-reflection, Tuan. Thank you very much. You actually think, yes, I was affected. And I reacted. My emotion got me reacting. and acting before I had a chance to think about what was appropriate, or before I had a chance to ask some questions to clarify what a situation was. Yeah, that happens a lot. Even Bishop Danny was talking this morning about, he started to realise when he finished the seminary, he just kept getting angry with the funeral director, angry with the secretary, angry with this one, angry with that one, angry with the Catholic school. Then he had to stop and think, wait a minute, what's the emotion? Why is the emotion being generated here? Now, look, that's where supervision is important. And I don't just mean, you know, the archdiocesan imposition of supervision. It's much better if you kind of do it yourself, find somebody that is helpful for you, not only a spiritual director, but somebody who can help negotiate the contemporary situation using the insights from the behavioural sciences, which all sounds very pedestrian, but it's not, because the God's portal to humans is through sense experience. And until I learn to ride that sense experience and relativise it, and learn how to read my emotions. What are my emotions telling me? What's the information that's coming? How do I interpret what my emotion is telling me? I'll tend to be reactive, and a lot of the time just, I don't know, regret my response. It won't be a thought-out response. And that's not because anybody's being a bad person or they're, you know, sloppy or they should have done something different. It's just, as Twan was saying, the training isn't there to do it. It's just not. So you can't actually do something unless you've been trained to do it. Thanks, Twan. Would anyone else like to make a comment from their conversations that they're having? Just aware we've got about 27 minutes. Would anyone else just like to throw something into the conversation? Tom.
Sorry, this table's going to dominate.
Oh, that's all right. It's not.
I'm getting my steps up.
Yeah,
It's
good.
looking pretty good.
Good.
Just one of the things I know with my role as spiritual director, and I suppose growing into that role, is not just to accept things at face value,
Yes.
to assume that I understand the other person's language.
Yep.
Because often there's a translation that happens in me to say,
Yes.
oh, I know exactly what you're talking about.
Oh, yes.
When I don't.
Yes. Mm.
And it's almost holding the word for the other person, or holding the experience for the other person, so that then it's not my experience, it's their experience, and to hold it for them.
That's right. Yes, as spiritual director, you'd be getting a lot of practice at having to sort out what's your stuff and the other person's stuff. You've got to do that, otherwise you end up having either a conversation with yourself or missing the other person kind of entirely. But the effortful bit is letting the space for the other person's subjective truth, which may not accord with anything that you're thinking about, to take up residence within you emotionally and intellectually, sufficiently for you to be able to understand it. When you understand what's happening for someone, you will have empathised to have been able to get something of the subjective experience of what they're going through, and then you will have been able to think about it. And maybe even be able to feed it back so that the other person knows that they're understood. Now, why is that important? You know, people sometimes think, oh, we all know that. Try and do it on a regular basis. I'd spend a lot of time learning how to do it, to be a psychotherapist. Now, okay, I've made a specialty of it, but it's not just, you know, over there, therapists do it, and official God people don't do it at all. And there's going to be a variation in how people can do it. Not everybody's good at listening and dialogue and doing the emoting and then the thinking. Then it's not. But certainly being able to at least step up and be able to bear witness, which involves listening, involves attending, encountering, attending and listening, is something that, look, years and years and years ago, before it was shut down, I think it's very interesting, we had a wonderful Master of Pastoral Counselling course, the Catholic Institute of Sydney. It only lasted 5 years. It was shut down for all sorts of reasons. People still ask, is that course still going? I have to say no, it's not going anymore. But within a 2-year period, there were 23 graduates. All of them became excellent counsellors. Some of them became splendid counsellors and have continued on with further training. But a 2-year period where they're able to be present to the realm of discourse that's psychology, cherry pick the good things out of it that were helpful, get rid of the other stuff that gets in the way of the Christian worldview, and then learn the skills of attending and interpreting. Now, it took 2 years part-time, but they could all do it. And it wasn't hard. In fact, it was enjoyable. It was enjoyable to actually feel this God-given gift that's in all of us, most of us, being able to be developed and brought to the fore. Now, to me, it's such a big gap in the formation of clergy, and I really don't know what to do about it. Certainly depends on a particular local church as to how much an importance is given. I think it's interesting that in a conference like this, there would be a little workshop given over to the nitty-gritty, the grounding of this notion that Pope Francis has loosed upon the church. How do we make the dialoguing a reality? So look, what I'd like to look at in the 20 minutes remaining, if you can go to the section after those 2 questions that I posed to you, and then we can just look down at the list. They're not in any particular order, but this is what I've come up with as I've thought about synodality as a lay person, as a psychologist, as somebody who's privileged to be able to assist the church in one way or another, and what some of the challenges and what some of the necessary resources are going to be, so that synodality becomes not a talk fest, but actually a part of the landscape. So the first thing to think about is, or first question, what are the implicit and explicit? What of the implicit and explicit hierarchical structure of the ecclesial reality? So it's a very sort of top-down structure. Once again, we're not blaming anyone, we're just describing. Does that hierarchical structure get in the way of dialogue? In my observation, it does. It's different from diocese to diocese. Each diocese seems to be very dependent, more or less, on the, it's conditioned very much by the personality of the bishop. Or may not even be the real personality of the bishop, but how the bishop is perceived. And the smaller the diocese, the more impactful the personality of the bishop. There is, first of all, a psychological inhibition when speaking to authority. Some priests find that very difficult, if not impossible, to dialogue with their bishop. This is just a fact. So, as a priest, what do? Do I give up, or do I keep reflecting on what's going wrong? How does this sort of reflecting sit within the current attempt to shift into dialogical gear? So, is reflecting on what's going wrong in a dialogue with maybe my ordinary, is that reflecting important, or do I just give it up and say, oh, what's the point? Second point, there's pressure on bishops to manifest synodality, and I feel great sympathy here, because bishops can't listen to everyone. So how to calibrate what needs to be heard so a bishop can hear it? Dialogue and conversation can't be friendly and spontaneous at this level. So who organises the dialogue? What are their biases, prejudices and blind spots? I think this was one of the criticisms of the synod meeting back in October. Individuals can think they're entering into a reciprocal dialogue, but we all have blind spots. A true dialogue is a rare beast and certainly will be difficult to attain. Now, the next is an issue that's very important to me, being involved in theological education for such a long time. The laity also need appropriate formation so that they can enter into a dialogue. Somebody mentioned this before, accusing the Church of clericalism. I think it was yourself, that there's also laicalism, you know, the laity wanting things to be a certain way and not changing. The ones that do want change, I think, are the ones that have walked away, and that's terrible. I think adult education courses that provide solid Catholic foundations are sorely needed in every diocese. Courses should include basic theological thinking and church history. That is so important, church history, particularly the church since the Reformation, the church since Vatican II. A lot of people's ignorance about the flow of the church. The church has changed over and over and over again. That comes as quite a surprise to a lot of people. So I think you need to open up the doors on basic theological thinking, church history, how to read scripture, and to understand the sacraments. And a degree in theology costing many thousands of dollars should not be the only resource, whether it's online or not. You know, it costs $2,200 to do a 13-week course. That's a lot of money. So you multiply that by 24, and you've got nearly $50,000 to earn a theology degree. And that's outside the means of a lot of people. The need for good... Now, a lot of people don't want a degree. They just want good information so that they continue to make a contribution to the church. Now, the church still needs to be administered to, and this is an era where all opinions, informed or not, assume an entitlement to expression. Can you listen to everyone who has an opinion? There are limits to listening. How do the opinions of the faithful reach the ear of authority? And what of the authority's capacity to listen? And does everyone's opinion need to be listened to? There's a big space between the voices wanting to be heard and the current configuration of the church. I think into that space the Holy Spirit wants to come. I think there's also a need for the so-called human and spiritual dimensions of the human person to be brought together conceptually. I know that historically they've been separated out, the spiritual and the human, but experientially they're not divided. And where once there was a focus on God's transcendence and human experience was ignored as not important, it's really how you focus yourself morally and practice your Catholicism. Now there's more of an emphasis on God's immanence, God's closeness in my experience, but there's also a reaction away from that in those who, you see it in those who are wanting to maintain the extraordinary form of the liturgy. Pressing on, other things to be considered. The lifestyle of celibacy and diocesan priesthood needs to be considered. This lifestyle can militate against relationality, even though in recent years there's been an encouragement to become more open to others and their experiences. This flies in the face of a long tradition of being a lone ranger. Now, once again, not saying anyone's doing anything they shouldn't be doing, but this notion of dialogue, where the lifestyle is often not one that encourages it, that encourages sort of putting up with people at close quarters, I think there certainly is a level of challenge there. Moving on, there are some individuals who are simply not able to dialogue. Dialogical conversation is a skill that can be learned, but not by everyone to the same degree. You need at least two parties to a dialogue, preferably where both are able to listen to and understand what the other is saying. This is not always the case, particularly for those who are not articulate relationally, are highly introverted, or who are frankly neurodiverse. Okay, now, are there any questions so far before I barrel on with more of these? Anybody want to make a comment on anything that I'm saying? Yes. Here we get the old mic coming.
Well, I just wanted to say, well, listening is not necessarily agreeing.
No, 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 no. The comment is that listening is not necessarily agreeing. No, it's not. But it's countenancing what's been said and being able to evaluate it, certainly to have my own response to it, but then also to see what it means for the other person. Now, look, that's a hard call. You know, when you think about it, it's a really difficult thing to do. It's not. It's something that requires a lot of self-awareness, where I can become. Well, it's like what Tuan was saying before. Somebody came along with an issue, and he noticed that he reacted very quickly, and then only afterwards he was able to think, oh. I didn't agree with what was going on, but my emotion got in the way of me being able to hear the context within which she was experiencing what she was experiencing. This kind of thing is actually quite difficult to do, what I'm encouraging here. If you don't feel like it's normative as far as the culture within which you're ministering. So if you feel like, you know, you're a priest that's good at listening and no one else is, or nobody else thinks it's very important, it's going to be sort of difficult to kind of maintain your mode of encounter, you know, because you'll feel a bit sort of deviant, you know, that the structures are not supporting me. Now, I'm not saying the structures won't support you by being present to suffering people, but certainly to be able to dialogue, you know, in deaneries, at a council of priests, where there can be spirited kind of engagement, and to actually feel as though that spirited engagement is involved in a process of discernment, because that's what it is. When spirited engagement can facilitate the process of discernment. If that's not the norm within a particular culture and you try and do it, you will feel as though you're looked at and probably going to be pathologised. As somebody who's a bit of a rabble-rouser, why do they keep mucking things up? Or why do they keep raising issues that we either don't have time or inclination to talk about? Once again, I'm not criticising anyone, I'm just trying to describe what can sometimes happen with a group of people that is relatively homogeneous. You know, the clergy are not a diverse group. You don't get, you know, great dissension often. So listening, you're quite right, does not necessarily mean agreement, but it means being able to know what the other person is trying to say. Anyone else want to say something? No? Yes, Paul?
Just taking that one step further,
Yes.
I think dialogue can leave people in very different situations. You can listen and hear what the other person is saying.
Yep.
There's no resolution.
Yes.
Conflict resolution doesn't necessarily happen.
Yep.
They just, okay, we agree to differ as the outcome. And that's not what a discernment process is. That's a further step.
Yes.
It's being open not only to hear, but potentially to actually change.
Yes.
And that's, I think, one of the tensions in perhaps in our own lives in working our way forward in a situation of discernment. You know, what should I do in the future? What choice should I make? But in terms of the communal process, it's helping people to understand that it's not necessarily that everyone's going to get their point of view listened to, yes, but not actually acted on.
I think the structures within which dialogue can take place, and dialogue is about around issues that are important to both parties. Certainly it's good to be able to listen to people who come along for some sort of pastoral care, but where there's dialogue encouraged, it's usually between at least two people where both are dialoguing something that's important It's value laden for both. There needs to be structures that enable that kind of dialogue to take place. Now, initially, I think they're going to be, well, I suppose along the lines of the plenary council, I think. Look, I think starting off, moving into a synodal church, there's got to be a starting point. I think it's so vast, that the undertaking is so great, and it's so at variance with the current norms, that it seems a bit of a novelty, good if we can actually ground it. But there's going to be an awful lot of situations that I can think of where I can see that it's just not going to work, or dialogue is just not going to produce the requisite way forward. Listening is not necessarily agreement. Do we have to move forward with agreement? It is, I think one of the advantages of the Latin Church, as I know it, is that there is, in the final analysis, there can be the prudent use of authority that says, I've listened to all sides and this is what we're going to do. But I really have listened to all sides. You can't look at, I supervise this dear young man out at the back blocks of Queensland who he's taking the synodal imprimatur very seriously, and he's moved into this, as I say, church that's been sort of run down for quite some time, and he's trying to sort of dialogue with the people about what they want. Where do they want the Blessed Sacrament? Are they okay with screens in the church? And he's asking everybody, until somebody in the church has said, for heaven's sake, Father, will you just make a decision? We don't want to talk about it anymore, So they're wanting him to be able to listen to everybody, but then make a decision and put up with the consequences. There'll be many situations within a synodal environment where the appropriate use of authority is called for. But I think one of the problems at the moment is that people often feel that authority is being utilised maybe where the listening hasn't happened. Now, I know that's a big call, but it does seem to be what's sort of percolating up from, I suppose, grassroots. And am I hearing you correctly, Paul?
It's a bit wider than that, I think.
Yeah.
It's the acceptance of the reality that there will be questions that will not, even at the end of the period
Yes.
of trial, that will not have a resolution.
Oh, yes, I think that's right.
And discernment is about helping people to come to the acceptance that the resolution is not that
Yes,
they want.
and I think that's another kind of tricky bit in the whole process of being able to dialogue. That now and again it will reach a point where you can't just you can't wait for consensus before everyone's happy. Otherwise, you just get lowest common denominator, and then nothing much happens. Which is why I think you need the dialogue does need to be spirit inspired. But I think there is a. I guess all I can say is I think that's right. That's going to be another challenge as to how people deal with not being able to get the outcome that they see, and they're not.
Yeah. Ordination of women could be a good practical example.
Well, yes.
As an example, there will be some groups who would say that's the outcome they want, and that they're not being listened to until you get that outcome. Well, yes, I can hear what they're saying, but there are a whole lot of other factors that are going to hinge on that.
Yes, but I think opening up the dialogue, it hasn't opened up yet. If you've got a dialogue and it comes to a consent, no, we're not going to do it, and these are the reasons why, fine. But to make a fit that it's just never going to be discussed, I mean, that's not synodal, I think. How are we going? We've got 5 minutes. Yes.
Even if the Synod comes up with a recommendation, it's not necessarily that it's going to fly, because the Pope has got the final say.
Sure.
For example, with the Amazon
Yes.
about the deacons being put into
Yes.
the priesthood,
Yep.
the majority was, they had the majority, but Pope Francis vetoed that. So just because we have a consensus doesn't necessarily mean it'll become reality.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think he has been criticised for encouraging a synodality but having a tendency to be a bit autocratic when he chooses to be, you know. Okay. Once again, it's a landscape it's incomplete. Yep, one more.
Oh, sorry,
Yeah.
I just want to say, I found it interesting, point 6, the lifestyle of celibacy. I'm with a religious order, but I spent 6 years living remote by myself.
Yep.
And I noticed that when I moved back into community in another, I had to change, because it was always what living by myself,
Yeah.
what music I want to listen to,
Sure.
what I want to watch on the TV,
Yeah.
but when you go back to a community, you've got to think of other people.
Absolutely.
And I think that's one of the benefits of religious life. It sort of grounds you that we are a communal people, and human beings are made for communion with others. And I've lived in other countries too, where the idea of celibacy in the priesthood is very, like, it's a secondary thing, and a lot of people don't adhere to that, and they do live a lifestyle of a married man. And that's the reality of the local church in that area.
Which would be another dimension that would have to be countenanced. So, but there's got to be an organisation about the dialogue, and I think given the fact that I say right at the end that I think there were two topics, the synod, prior to this synod, that would have been good to focus on first. One is authority within the church, and the secondly is formation for the laity to discern their call to mission. The laity are often not in a position where they can actually enter into dialogue. They're just not formed enough. And even though some of the dialogue is going to fall to the so-called professional laity, at the moment I think that's just the way it is. But other people need to be heard, and structures wherein people are able to be heard are going to need to be important. Look, I'd just like to draw your attention to 2 points and then we'll stop. The last is point 10 on page 9. I think it would be imperative that the ACBC establish a synodal council structure where clergy, religious and lay meet together to address issues in the life of the church. Oh, you don't? Okay, I don't know why, but not to worry. Life isn't perfect. So what I'm suggesting is a synodal council to structure where clergy, religious and lay meet together to address issues in the life of the church, and that representatives on the council can represent the various dioceses and with a rotating chair. And this would mitigate the possibility that the synod ends up fulfilling people's worst fears, that is the talk fest. And then I also, right at the end, I say, look, the synod is already acting as a corrective to communication within the church. As a result of this synod, autocratic, top-down, one-way communication to clergy from bishops and vicars general will still happen, of course, but I believe such communication will appear less and less acceptable in the way that individual dioceses conduct their administration. And it remains to be seen whether this will allow the broader ecclesial culture to move closer to what the Pope envisages. So, as I say, you can't unring the bell. Dialogue is out there. Whether it continues and how it's going to be structured and incorporated, I'm not sure. But certainly at the moment, I think that that monologuing, one-way communication is starting to be seen as less and less acceptable. It might still be the norm in certain places, but it's less and less acceptable. So I'll leave you with those thoughts, and maybe you can skip through the paper when you have some time. Sorry to have rushed you through, and thanks for your attention.